we can start. Danuta Hubner apologizes, but she will come later, and I will start with our workshop on the implication of Brexit on the Irish border, a very hard subject. As you know, we have 4 interventions. Three interventions, but one from 2 people. The first, the 2 persons who will start are Dr. David Finnemore and Dr. Katie Hayward. If I understood correctly, Dr. Hayward will start, and after Dr. Finnemore. So you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you today. Although we're approaching the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, it's best understood not as an historical document, but as a living and dynamic agreement. And we can see this in the fact that both David and I teach a whole generation of students who have grown up under the agreement and have known peace as a consequence of that agreement. We also see the agreement as a living document because the conflict is not resolved, and it is a fragile peace in Northern Ireland. And we see this in the very fact that the 1998 agreement has 2 different names. It's known as the Belfast Agreement as well as the Good Friday Agreement, reflecting some tensions there. We also see that the agreement is a dynamic agreement because it has been built upon since 1998 with successor agreements, and all the main parties in Northern Ireland are signed up to those successor agreements, which builds upon that Good Friday Agreement. There is a lot of detail in the report that we have submitted, and so in my presentation I'm just going to outline main reasons why Brexit is so significant for the Good Friday Agreement, and then my colleague David will discuss some of the solutions. Firstly, how the conflict is framed in the agreement. In the text of the agreement itself, we see that the conflict is defined as being between 2 traditions. Those are not defined as Catholic and Protestant, but rather unionist and nationalist. And there's an understanding that identities and cultures, histories and political aspirations differ profoundly between those 2 traditions, and that they are upheld and represented by the British and Irish states. Core to that agreement is the point that both political aspirations and identities are equally legitimate. The UK-Irish relationship is fundamental to the agreement, and it underwrites the whole success of it all. There are key principles to the agreement. I'm just going to mention a couple here. The first is that of self-determination for the peoples of the island of Ireland alone. This draws our attention to the fact that peace in Northern Ireland is not an internal domestic matter for the United Kingdom alone. The Irish government and the Irish people also have an important role. Another key principle is that of majority consent, so that any change to the constitutional status of Northern Ireland has to be approved by a majority in Northern Ireland as well as the Republic of Ireland. And this means that Ireland has retracted its historical irredentist claim over the territory of Northern Ireland. Another point about the framing of the Good Friday Agreement is that it is based on the principle of multi-level governance. This is a principle that's very familiar, of course, in a European context. Fundamentally, it shows us that Northern Ireland cannot be dealt with as a standalone matter. The 3 strands of the agreement within Northern Ireland, north and south on the island of Ireland, and east-west between Britain and Ireland, are interlocking and interdependent, and any solution for the future of Northern Ireland has to recognise that principle. To outline briefly the importance of the European Union for the agreement, as we say in the report, the number of mentions that the European Union gets in the text of the agreement is almost beside the point. The European Union has provided the fundamentally vital context within which the agreement can be conceived. It is a model and framework for the success of that agreement. In so doing, The European Union doesn't have any compulsory influence, it doesn't wield a carrot or stick over the success of the agreement, nor does it play a high-profile or visible role. Instead, its role has been that of an enabler, of a facilitator, and it would have been inconceivable to have such an agreement without the European Union context. It's notable that in the declaration of support for the Good Friday Agreement, similarly to the declaration of support for the 1985 Anglo-Irish Agreement, the UK and Ireland state their relationship as partners in the European Union as being fundamentally important. Of course, the process of cross-border cooperation and integration means that the UK and Ireland have been on the same trajectory, and this has been critical for facilitating close, productive relations across the island of Ireland and between Britain and Ireland. This integration has been on the principle of mutual benefit, shared interests. Critically, it's been depoliticised to a large extent. Another interesting and important point, of course, provided by the European Union context, is that of the stimulus for the all-Ireland economy. And core to this has been regulatory convergence between North and South. Lastly from me, just to identify some of the key challenges posed by Brexit. I think fundamentally we can see already that Brexit is causing some instability in the peace process, and most particularly it's having a polarising effect. And this is largely because the choice is being posed between Northern Ireland being either closer to Britain or closer to the Republic of Ireland. And this is exactly the kind of binary choice that the agreement transcended and showed, indeed, it was anathema to peace in Northern Ireland. To pose such a choice, either or, contravenes the spirit and tenets of the agreement. Secondly, a key challenge posed by Brexit is that cross-border cooperation is repoliticised. And indeed, it makes it difficult to conceive of it as being normal or just part of everyday activities. And this poses challenges to the stability and success of the agreement. And then finally, the agreement is premised on the principle of the equality of British and Irish citizens in Northern Ireland and of the security of their human rights. Any challenge to that principle poses a risk to the agreement and to the peace process in Northern Ireland. I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, it's to me to offer some of the, or to go through some of the suggestions that we put in the report as to how you can continue to uphold the agreement in the context of Brexit. I say upholding the agreement. There's another dimension which is equally, arguably, if not more important, and that is how does one maintain the context for the continued implementation of the agreement, both at, and I want to talk through some macro-level solutions, and also some issues around the soft border and also some degree of the cross-border cooperation. In terms of upholding the agreement, there's evident progress in the commitments that have already been issued, both by the British government and also the EU27, to uphold the Belfast Agreement and recognise its contribution to the peace process in Northern Ireland. We've also had some very useful references to the unique circumstances on the island of Ireland that need to be respected, and also the desire, or willingness at least, to pursue flexible and imaginative solutions. Our argument is that this creates a very useful space in which to address some of the challenges which Dr. Hayward has already identified. Okay. If I turn specifically to the agreement itself, I think there's a number of areas where we have to ask the question, what can actually be done to turn the words of flexibility, imagination and upholding the agreement into actual actions? How is it that we can protect, not just recognise, the EU rights of Irish citizens in Northern Ireland? Is there to be some role, as my colleague Chris McCrudden has suggested, for the Court of Justice of the European Union in that respect? How do we maintain some degree of representation of Irish EU citizens in Northern Ireland in EU institutions, notably the European Parliament? is it possible to consider them voting for any transnational seats that may become available, or granting some degree of observer status if the representation rights are to be maintained? What we also argue in the paper is that when we're thinking through the ways in which we can address the challenges for maintaining upholding the agreement, is that we look at the key role that the institutions established under the agreement can play, and that the solution to the future of the agreement lies as much in exploiting the agreement per se as it may be the actual terms of the UK's withdrawal from the EU or the future relationship which it has. The key challenge that we have is, however, we would argue, maintaining the context for the effective implementation of the agreement. This is arguably a reflection of the vital role that European integration has played, particularly the European Union, in providing, through shared membership of the United Kingdom and Ireland, for the implementation, particularly around the four freedoms. Those have been vital to the economic activity on the island, vital in supporting economic activity, and also North-South cooperation. So what we're saying is that there's four key issues which need to be addressed. One is, in the context of Brexit, minimising the disruption to economic activity on the island of Ireland. And here I think it's worth noting the role that economic prosperity plays, according to the British government, in the success of the peace process. Secondly, we need to ensure that the border is kept as soft as possible and ideally as soft as it is today. Thirdly, that there needs to be maintained the common legal and regulatory frameworks which currently exist. And then fourthly, we need to maintain the opportunities which exist and have been exploited to date for institutionalised cross-border cooperation. How can this be done? Well, we offer a number of ideas in the paper which draw on ideas which others have offered in the debate around Brexit, and particularly the position of Northern Ireland and Ireland in that. And there are others. I think if we'd included everything, the paper would have been twice the length it already is. Okay. I suppose the ideal point to address the issues which you just highlighted is for the United Kingdom to maintain or to establish a relationship with the EU which is as close as possible to the status quo, and in particular remaining in or part of a customs union and the single market. Alternatively, it has been suggested that Northern Ireland could remain in the EU through either the reverse Greenland model or designated special status in the EU. We recognised in the paper that there is little political appetite for those options. Consequently, our key argument is that we need to look at some form of differentiated treatment of Northern Ireland in the context of Brexit. And that therefore we should be looking at whether there are opportunities to, or whether there's an option of keeping Northern Ireland in the single market through some form of participation in the European Economic Area. Those of us who've written on that argue that that is no panacea for the challenges which Brexit poses for Northern Ireland. Most notably, it would still raise the issue of border controls around the movement of goods because Northern Ireland would be outside the customs union. It therefore follows, is there an argument to say that Northern Ireland could be kept in the customs union or a customs union relationship with the EU? That, though, in itself would not address the issue of agricultural trade, which is so important for certain areas of Northern Ireland, particularly around the border, and there are obviously examples of quite developed cross-border supply chains as well as trade. Could, therefore, arrangements be found such that Northern Ireland could retain agricultural free trade, at least on the island of Ireland, if not with the wider EU? Now, we recognise that there are major political issues and challenges around these options, but it is our view that there is no insurmountable legal obstacle to actually achieving these. It comes down to a question of political preference and political will. If none of these options are available, what else could actually be pursued? I think what's important here is that there should be two foci. One is maintaining the softest border possible. That's vitally important for the success of the economy, but it's also, I think, vitally important for the continuation of the Good Friday Agreement, Belfast Agreement, and also supporting the peace process. Here, there are major challenges around the movement of goods. And we're going to hear later in another report from Mr. Lars Carlson on possible ways of addressing those technically. I think it has to be said that in a Northern Ireland context, a focus exclusively on technical options and solutions is suboptimal at best. It's also we need to recognise the particular nature of the border in Northern Ireland, both geographically and politically, and the nature of and the importance of cross-border trade to the economy. Beyond trade, I think it's important to realise or to respect the role that EU programmes have played to date for the economic prosperity of Northern Ireland, for supporting the development of all island markets, and also for North-South cooperation. It therefore follows that if we're to sustain those vital elements of the peace process, that there needs to be retained some degree of access for Northern Ireland into EU programmes and funding arrangements, whether that be structural funds, whether that could be the European Investment Bank, whether that could be Interreg, whether it be the framework research programmes. If there isn't to be direct access for Northern Ireland, can creative ways be found of allowing cross-border all-island projects to be eligible for funding in those areas? Or could agents in Northern Ireland be badged as Irish for the purpose of access to those programmes? We developed these arguments or these ideas a little bit in the paper, and we're suggesting that these certainly fit the idea of finding flexible and imaginative solutions, drawing on differentiated integration to address some of the challenges that Northern Ireland faces in the context of Brexit, most notably in terms of upholding the Good Friday Agreement and ensuring its successful implementation. If I make 4 points coming out of the report by way of conclusion, they'd be the following: that we need to maintain the regulatory context for free movement on the island of Ireland. Okay. Secondly, we need to ensure that the border remains as unobstructive and as soft as possible. Thirdly, that we need to see Northern Ireland as a point of contact between the UK and Ireland, the EU. And then fourthly, we need to use the principle of territorial differentiation which exists within the EU and which exists within the UK as well as a consequence of devolution, plus the idea of flexible and imaginative solutions to minimise as far as possible the disruption to the status quo. Through addressing these issues, I think we have a reasonable chance of upholding the Good Friday Agreement and ensuring its successful implementation in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Finemore. And I would like now to move to Dr. Lars Carlson. You are the border guy. I understand your whole professional life is with customs and borders, so we need solutions, I understand. Let's hope they will come with your speech. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great honor, privilege, and pleasure to be here today and address you on what I call Smart Borders 2.0, and it's correct. I am a customs guy. I worked with customs policy and border policy and trade policy for more than 30 years, and also worked in more than 120 countries and seen more than 700 borders. And yes, I do count. And I'm saying that, yes, so you would not be surprised that I will address issues around borders and customs in the following minutes to go now. But I will start with another story. And on the 13th of April 1970, Jim Lowell got famous by saying, "Houston, we have a problem." And that is now used as an illustration of when we have great challenges ahead. And of course, you would not be surprised if I say, Brussels, London, we do have a problem. But I'm saying so for the reason why Jim Lowell actually managed, as the commander of Apollo 13, being in space, getting back to Earth, was that he used his competence, his experience, and his technical skill applied in a different way to actually bring that spacecraft and that crew back home. And I'm suggesting we're going to do the same when we talk about how actually borders actually are handled. Because there's some bad news and some good news. And if I start always with the bad news because we want to get to the good ones, of course, leaving a customs union and a customs territory means one thing: you actually leave the customs territory. And what we do know from international experience over the last 30 years is that when you do so, there will be a restatement of the border. And we need to acknowledge the fact that that is actually going to happen. And it's more about how we actually can make that happen in a way where we do get all the benefits of actually managing that border in a smart and modern and functional way. And of course, the good news is that if we look at the border of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and my colleagues on the panel have shown that in their reports as well, it is a very vital border. And even if the border isn't there very much today, we can see the movement of people and the movement of goods is substantial. And we actually then need to find a solution that can handle this situation. So to the good news. The good news is that we actually do know how to handle these type of things from a technical perspective. Because 15 years ago we didn't know what globalization meant, now we do know. And globalization actually drives harmonization. And today we actually have international standards in the field of customs and borders that actually provides models that could make this border work as invisible as possible, while still taking care of those necessary things that need to happen by the border. Because a border needs to be managed. And a border needs to be managed not always only from the reasons we read in media. For instance, one of the obvious things we all think about is clearly to collect different types of duties and customs duties and taxes. That is one of the functions of how to manage the border. There are many others. There are issues around security, there are issues around safety, there's issues around how actually to handle goods with different status passing through those two territories when passing through a border, and many other reasons why we need to manage the borders regardless of what taxes and duties are in place. So when you read about the fact that we could have a zero duty rate or we could have this or that trade agreement in place, it doesn't change the fact that we need to manage the border anyway. We could do it in different ways, and of course that is the important thing. So what we have been looking at, and what I've been looking at this report, is saying what are the best practice examples that are around, because if we have international standards, we probably also have operational best practice examples, and that is correct. There's basically 3 examples that we have been looking at in this report and want to put forward without any details. You can read them, and I'm sure you have in the report. One is, of course, the Swedish-Norwegian border. The Swedish-Norwegian border is actually handling all of these issues I'm talking about in a very smooth and very smart and very fast and safe way. And the interesting thing with that example is that it put in place many of the components that actually are required when you manage a border. And the thing is also, of course, that that is actually an outer European Union border. To Norway in this case. And the interesting thing that I'm pointing at is that there are technical solutions there at that specific border that can be used and reused when we are looking at borders like the Northern Ireland and Ireland border. And I want to say this already now, that even though some of my colleagues, Drs. Finnemore and Hayward, but also Dr. Temple Lang, has been looking at this specific issue more from a policy, from political and maybe a macroeconomic and different types of ways. Of course, I also want to raise this issue of it does have a technical component. And even though some of my colleagues here is less optimistic that those technical components could actually do the job, I'm very much more optimistic than they are. So that's an issue for debate and discussion. The Swedish-Norwegian border certainly has elements that could be reused in the Northern Ireland framework. So has the Canada and US border, which is the second example we've been looking at, that has been there for a long period of time, that actually meets many of the international standards and are using the models that we are talking about in a very efficient way. The third example we have looked at is kind of an interesting example. You could ask why we look at that. That's Australia and New Zealand. And they obviously don't have a land border, but they do have some of the elements of international standards in place that, again, could be reused in a new version of that specific type of border. Which brings us to utilizing the standards that I'm talking about. And I won't go into detail, even though I could if you want to stay until tomorrow. I don't have that time. But there are a number of international standards in place. The issue is they haven't been implemented everywhere to the full extent. And one of the reasons why we today have the World Trade Organization Trade Facilitation Agreement is exactly that, to implement these standards fully into our economy. So that's a process that is already going on in the European Union and in the United Kingdom. So obviously, using these type of systems and doing them maybe in an upgraded application, doing it better and more integrated is a way to get forward. Which brings me to the smart border, which is a kind of a concept that appeared approximately 15 years ago, specifically in Northern America and Northern Europe. And it has a number of distinctive things around it. And one is to use and utilize the international standards that is already in place. The second thing that is very important for this one is to use coordination. That means in two perspectives. One is the coordination between different agencies on one side of the border, but it's also the coordination between the two sides of the border. Meaning, again, we shouldn't duplicate everything from requirements in relation to information or controls and whatever needs to be in place. The third element is risk management. We are very good at risk management today. We can always become better, but it's an important part of a smart border concept that you actually can do a lot of the things based on risk. And fourth, most important one, is that smart borders, you can actually move the necessary things that needs to happen in a border, regardless if we consider it to be hard or soft, to being done pre and post the border. And that specific type of compliance management regimes has been developed very much during the last 10 years, and today is international standard and implemented in many countries, and could be utilized, could be upgraded, could be simplified to also handle small and medium-sized companies and other types of specific arrangements. So what I'm proposing here, and I think should be something to consider, is again, from a technical perspective, to actually try to design and develop something called Smart Borders 2.0. Taking the experience from the international standards, from the operational examples that is already existing in the world, upgrading them, integrate them more, use the technology that is necessary and available today, and then again try to put this in place, together with a number of things we already know is working, for instance, from the Swedish-Norwegian border example. Which means, for instance, there needs to be a technical agreement between customs administration of exchange of data, information, so forth. There need to be different type of arrangements in place on how you actually work together, but it's possible to do. We have seen it operationally work. And these are components of the smart border, and I won't tell you about all of them because they are in the report, but they do exist. They are operational. They are working in places around the world. So in reality, we can actually put this in place also on the Norwegian-Irish border. Northern Ireland and Irish border. Because, again, we know that it works, but again, it needs to be applied differently on this specific border. Then some might argue that there needs to be a lot of technology in place, and that might be a very difficult and costly activity to actually put in place. Well, again, from the examples we've seen on these other studies we've done in the report, you can clearly see that there are examples, for instance, the Gateway example, which was tested between, again, European Union and Norway, a green corridor that was tested between European Union and Eastern countries, and many other examples where already existing infrastructure has been used and is fully possible to use, like, again, micro technology, different type of mobile technologies, and so forth. So while there are different technical options here, it is also possible to reuse already existing infrastructure to make this work without building an entire traditional border. Because one thing is really clear. If we actually agree that there is a border, the border needs to be there, it cannot be managed the same way as it's managed traditionally by customs and other agencies. So my conclusion, Madam Chairperson and ladies and gentlemen, is first of all, we need to acknowledge the fact that there will be a border, one type or another, and we need to manage it. And it's a common responsibility to manage that border. And we need to manage it as efficiently as possible. There are modern ways of doing it, and it is possible to actually do it. So, of course, putting together something like a smart border concept 2.0 is not rocket science, even though I made the example of actually traveling back from space before. But it's about using the already existing knowledge we have, the already existing international experiences. and again, the operational models that are there. So it's possible to do while still making sure the border is smooth and can actually work without too much cost involved or burdensome. So the World Customs Organization, the World Trade Organization, United Nations have put these models in place. We can implement them if we want to do, and this is the words of the World Customs Organization, borders divide, customs connect. My suggestion is that we actually have a look at this and see how a border could be managed in a way where it doesn't provide big queues at the borders, while still making sure that we know what is moving across the border for different reasons, to be able to not only manage that invisible border, but also to be able and use the international standards and use the international agreements that both European Union and United Kingdom will have to have in the future as well, to make trade work, to make trade safe, and make the world a safer place. If we can put a technical agreement and a technical solution and a technical model together, I'm pretty sure we could also negotiate and discuss the other matters that are more difficult matter and difficult culture and difficult ways in a more easy way. So again, I'm suggesting that we use the experience we have and be able to put this in place and do it as soon as possible. And I will end by a quote from a football trainer called Steve Mariucci, who says, "When are we going to do this? Well, I never wear a watch because I always know it's now, and now is the time to do it." Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for your optimism especially. But I would like now to give the floor to Professor Temple Lang, who will speak on political, economic and legal aspects of the challenge. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam. The economies of the two parts of Ireland are now very closely integrated with one another, and Brexit, unfortunately, risks disrupting that very seriously. The economy of Northern Ireland is going to suffer more from Brexit than any other region in Europe. So the future trade relationship between Ireland and the EU and the UK will be very important for both parts of Ireland. And that is why the Irish government is saying that the United Kingdom should stay in the single market. In fact, the future prosperity of Northern Ireland depends not only, and I think probably not primarily, on the trade arrangements that are made between the EU and the United Kingdom, or even on the question whether some special regime of some kind for Northern Ireland is invented or developed. The future of Northern Ireland will depend, the economic future of Northern Ireland will depend very much on future UK agricultural policy, and in particular on whether, as a result of bilateral trade agreements that the UK government is planning to make, there will be cheap imports, cheap agricultural imports into the UK from other countries, third countries all over the world. The other big influence on the future prosperity of Northern Ireland will be whatever decisions are taken in London in the next few years about the extent of fiscal transfers from the Exchequer in London to Northern Ireland. Now, you will see that of these 5 influences, only 2 of them are open to in the involvement or open to the direct involvement of the European Union. And as a result of the uncertainty about all of these elements, because none of them are going to get better for Northern Ireland, and all of them seem likely to deteriorate to a greater or lesser extent, Northern Ireland is very vulnerable, and consequently the parts of the Republic of Ireland which are dependent on trade with Northern Ireland are also vulnerable, and a lot of people are worried. There's been a good deal of discussion about the nature of the border that would be needed if certain things came about. Now, the important thing I think for you to bear in mind, because I think it hasn't been sufficiently emphasized, is that the problem of whether a border is visible or invisible is a political problem. It's not an economic problem. The need for a border results from whatever the economic relationship is between the entities on either side of the border. So when you're thinking about a visible border, you're not thinking about economics, you're thinking about politics, and one of the striking differences between the border that we're talking about this afternoon and the border between, for example, Sweden and Norway, is that in Ireland, unfortunately, there is organised crime on both sides of where the border would go, and some, at least, of the smugglers have been and might again become involved in paramilitary activities. So we're not just talking about economics, we're talking about politics. And no border, visible or invisible, high-tech or simple, can solve the economic problems that will result from an unsatisfactory economic arrangement between the United Kingdom and the European Union. That relationship depends on negotiations and on the future policies of the UK. It doesn't depend in any way on the physical or metaphysical or political version of the border. And I stress to you that trade between the Republic of Ireland and the island of Britain is actually much more important, and of course has nothing whatever to do with the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. A visible border, a border with physical infrastructure, with people, with controls, with equipment of one kind or another, would be needed, however politically unwelcome and unacceptable it might be, if, first, there was no agreement at all between the UK and the European Union. Secondly, if, as I think is likely, for reasons we can discuss, that the UK will adopt a cheap food policy for agricultural products when it makes bilateral trade agreements with third countries around the world. A visible border would be needed if the United Kingdom, for whatever reason, chose to adopt lower phytosanitary or animal health standards or lower standards in other respects about food purity or technical specifications, pharmaceuticals, and so on. A physical border would also be needed if the United Kingdom was free, under whatever new arrangements were made with the European Union, to subsidise in a liberal, uncontrolled way its own industries and its commerce. Since I'm afraid that these various influences are likely to happen, then I'm afraid there will be what we're calling a visible border, unless the United Kingdom is willing to consider, at least for the purposes of Northern Ireland and solving Northern Ireland's problems, a free trade area of some kind. A free trade area, not necessarily the European Economic Area, but probably very much like it in practice, a free trade area between Northern Ireland and the European Union would give Northern Ireland the best of both worlds. It would be trading freely with the EU, and it would naturally continue to be able to trade freely with the rest of the United Kingdom. There would, of course, be certain requirements for any such arrangement, but if they were politically acceptable, they would not be difficult to solve as an economic point of view. And that is why our friends, my friends and my fellow speakers colleagues in Queen's University have been advising and suggesting the adoption of a free trade solution for Northern Ireland specifically, even if the United Kingdom, for one reason or another, doesn't accept it. And that would be similar to the European Economic Area. Madam Chairman, thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to open the floor for discussion. I'm sorry, I have already this list. So, Madam Diane Dodds.
Sorry. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you and a warm welcome to our speakers, particularly to my colleagues from Queen's University. Dr. Finnemore is one of my daughter's professors, so her advice to me before I came to this meeting today was, Mum, think carefully. A number of comments that I would like to make. First of all, can I preface them by saying that I am here as a member of the Democratic Unionist Party. And I'm saying that very specifically because of some references in the reports. And I want to make it absolutely clear that no one in Northern Ireland wants to go back to the violence of the past. No one wants to go back to the borders of the past, which I may add were mainly for security purposes. Northern Ireland has come a tremendously long way, and I think if you came to Northern Ireland you would see just how far our country has come, and that is, we do not seek to go backward. In terms of Dr. Finnemore and Dr. Hayward's presentation, I noticed that you talk about some kind of differentiated rules for Northern Ireland. Can I just draw your attention to the fact that there are differences between rules that be used for mutual cooperation between two sovereign states and being subsumed into a set of rules of which you are not going to be part after the Brexit has actually taken place. So I think that we need to remember the differences in all of that. I'm interested in your report that you do not specifically look at the relationship and the economic relationship between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, Dr. Hayward very helpfully on Sunday night posted some figures on Twitter, which I think we should all perhaps know and look at. And what those figures actually tell us from another colleague at Queen's University, that 60% of Northern Ireland's external sales are with the United Kingdom, with the Great Britain market. 60%. There are 15% are with the Republic of Ireland, and 16% with the rest of the world, and 9% with the rest of the EU. You can see automatically from the figures that our most important market is the GB market. So therefore, to hive us off in some kind of separate free trading area, some kind of separate relationship from the market that actually is most important to all of our companies would not just be politically and constitutionally unacceptable, it would be economically catastrophic. There's many other points, but I'm sure Dr. Finnemore and I will meet on many occasions to go through them. To Dr. Lang, I read your report, Dr. Lang, last night, and I must say that I was perturbed by the bias that I found in it. When I read sentences where you consider that the people who voted to leave the European Union, that their choice was based on prejudice, and I'm quoting from the report, prejudice, ignorance and nostalgia, I'm disinclined to actually think of this as a serious piece of work. It was a democratic decision by the people of the United Kingdom, and I think that this is quite unacceptable. In terms of, again, you refer to the Democratic Unionist Party and you refer to the Belfast Agreement, and saying that our current confidence and supply deal is in breach of that agreement. I just want you to know that that was recently tested in the courts in Northern Ireland. And Lord Justice Sales, sitting along with Mr Justice Lewis, threw this out of court, didn't even hear it, saying that it was not properly arguable in a court of law. And that confidence in supply agreements had nothing to do with the Belfast Agreement. Can I finish by saying to our colleague who has helpfully provided the paper in terms of solutions to the customs issues and the border issues, I think that the European Union in its opening statements promised flexible and imaginative solutions. This is the first example I've seen of the flexible and imaginative solutions. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, I close the list. We have 10 speakers and we cannot have more than 2 minutes per person if you want to listen to our experts. So please try to focus on the questions you might have and try to be as short as possible. Indeed, 2 minutes is something that we would allow everybody to speak, and we listen also to the answers. Martina Anderson.
I want to thank you all today for being here. And Katie, I'm sorry I missed the beginning of the presentation. I was on my way over from London, where we launched the legal advice to demonstrate and to show how special status, designated special status for the North to remain within the EU is possible, permissible, and can be delivered if the political will is there. And I would like to take up maybe on where David had talked about the differentiated approach and the territorial differentiation, because that in effect is something that has been talked about in the legal advice around Greenland reverse of a tailored differentiated package. And we know there are 25 overseas countries and territories here with different tailored packages. So I think that is definitely an aspect worth exploring. I think what is interesting about the report that both of you did, that you contextualise it in the stability in terms of the Good Friday Agreement, borders around regulatory standards and rights, the no diminution of rights. So it goes broader than just borders. And I think that's something that this committee has been looking at, and I deeply appreciate the understanding that has been developed in this committee about what the Good Friday Agreement and all of its parts means. Lars, I have to say, when I was listening to you about the issue of smart borders, that would be okay if we weren't in a situation of a country that has been partitioned and a country that is emerging from conflict. And you talked about it has to be managed, and it's not rocket science, and all of that is very well and good. But I'm not being ignorant when I say that your smart border proposal is a stupid border solution to the problems that we are dealing with in the north. It may be okay if you were dealing with a different country and in a different place, but for Ireland, I don't think it would work at all. John, I think you touched on it very well when you talked about what Britain intends to do with the cheap food policy. And I'm sure for the many thousands of farmers in the north, they will see that as something that is going to damage the work that they do and their farms primarily. Let's all be very clear, and you talked about a lowering of animal health. If we hadn't got the All-Ireland Animal Health Strategy when we were dealing with Blue Tongue, we would not have been able to resolve it. So when we are talking about a physical border, and there has been an opinion poll just recently that has shown that 60% of the people in the unionist community are looking at the border and accepting that a border in an Irish Sea as opposed to the border inland. And when you consider the 562 MEPs here in the European Parliament voted that the North, of course we believe that Britain should stay in the customs union and the single market, that's a no-brainer, but if they are not, that at least the North needs to remain in the customs union and the single market, and that is the only way that we're going to have the kind of regulatory standards and not do damage to Strand 2 of the Good Friday Agreement, the All-Ireland element of the Good Friday Agreement. So when we say as a Parliament we're going to preserve and protect the Good Friday Agreement in all of its parts, that's the three strands of the agreement. That's strands 1, 2 and 3, and as the first report David and Katie outlined, it's not just about borders, it's about stability, it's about rights, it's about no diminution of rights, and I think this committee has captured all of the problems around that. Sorry for going over my time, but you can understand I'm quite passionate about this issue.
Thank you very much. I would insist on 2 minutes. Mercedes Bresso. Mercedes.
Grazie Presidente.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think it goes without saying that this is a very interesting discussion, and the different proposals are also interesting. It's hard to decide, however, between the different scenarios. It's hard to know what should provide the basis for a formal proposal regarding the border. So a first question to Professor Larssons regarding smart borders. The problem is, between Norway and Sweden, it's true to say that it's perhaps not an EU border, but Norway is part of the EEA. If I'm not mistaken, it's also a member of Schengen, which makes it much easier to manage the border. So my question, even if the United Kingdom were to refuse the idea of a separate status for Northern Ireland, and if the UK were outside the single market and the customs union, would it be possible to have a smart border given the highly complex nature of such a situation? To the other panellists, I would like to ask you almost the opposite question, in fact. How do you think it would be possible to provide guarantees for the Good Friday Agreement without a border? In other words, if the UK as a whole didn't remain in the customs union and the single market. Some people might talk about a model based perhaps more on Switzerland and the EEA. So if there weren't to be a border, can you conceive of a situation in which it would still be possible to provide the guarantees for the Good Friday Agreement, while at the same time maintaining the integrity of an EU border while allowing for the movement of goods? So we're talking about a border to all practical intents and purposes, and that would automatically surely require customs checks. So for me, I simply fail to understand how we can find a smart solution in the face of this fait accompli of the single market and the customs unit, and of course the principle of freedom of movement of persons, goods, so on, the four freedoms, in other words.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Ashley Fox, but I would like to warn you that I am going to use my hammer after 2 minutes. So it's just sorry to
Then I shall be concise, Madam President.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Haywards and Finnemore, thank you for your presentation. As you know, the British government is committed to the Good Friday Agreement and also committed to negotiating a deep and special partnership with our EU neighbours. You spoke of the equal validity of the two traditions in Northern Ireland, and you've heard two voices this afternoon, and you said they should be accorded equal respect. Both sides want to ensure that the border remains as soft and unobtrusive as possible. And yet when you spoke about differentiated treatment, that not only doesn't make much economic sense, as you've heard, but it also offends one of those traditions, and it breaches the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom. And I wondered, could you explain why you think that offending one tradition is acceptable in your proposed solution, but not the other? I'd be interested for your take on that. Mr. Carlson, thank you for your report. I agree with you entirely. We need a smart, smooth, fast and safe way to establish, hopefully, a completely invisible border. You didn't wish to be pressed on timescale, but imagine that the United Kingdom was to leave the EU in March 2019, and there was to be a 2-year transition. So you've got March 2021 as your date for getting this operational. When would you need to start? And finally, a comment to Dr. Temple Lang. I too was disappointed by your remark on page 10, where you say, quotes, "The decision to leave was not the result of a carefully considered assessment by UK politicians, but an instinctive ideological choice based on prejudice, ignorance and nostalgia." speaking as someone who campaigned to remain, I think that comment shows your own prejudice and ignorance, and it's deeply regrettable to see such a comment in a report before this Parliament.
That was perfect, and also you asked my question, which is time factor. So I would just like to underline, Mr. Carlson, that this time factor is extremely important to see how it. Brian Hayes.
Thank you, Co-Chair, and I very much enjoyed the presentations that were made today. Can I ask both of the contributions that have been made from colleagues from Queen's University Belfast? It seems to me, in looking at your solution, it's this question of regulatory equivalence. And you seem to suggest in the report that the North-South Ministerial Council, which has within it, of course, the North-South bodies, which are coming directly under Strand 2 from the Good Friday Agreement, it could be used for the purposes of, am I right in saying, regulatory equivalence. So is it possible, in your view, that where we operate on a North-South basis, under the agreement, under the North-South Ministerial Council and the bodies that underlie that, that we could have EU regulations applying in those specific areas? My understanding is in the current constitutional setup in the United Kingdom, parts of the United Kingdom currently transpose various parts of regulations, EU-wide regulations. So in other words, you could have a circumstance in Scotland that the regulations that would apply are not applying, whereas if we had a functioning government in Northern Ireland with the devolved assembly, transposition of EU regulations occurs there on a continuous basis once that power has been ceded by Westminster. So do you think that's possible, that you could have in those designated areas under the agreement EU-wide regulation, and then obviously for the other issues, East-West, which Diane rightly points out is the majority of the trade from Northern Ireland, that the UK regulations would apply? So in other words, is it possible to have, to use your own words, Northern Ireland getting the best of both worlds in terms of a smart outcome to this? And that's just, and one last, I'd be very interested in your remarks on that. And my final remark, to agree fully with Dr. Temple Lang and his remarks about criminality, hard border. We know from our past, north and south, where hard borders exist, criminality and paramilitarism takes hold. We know that from a Dublin perspective, we know from the perspective of the sovereign government in Dublin and the sovereign government in the UK. And we all have an interest in making sure that the environment isn't right for that to occur again in the future, as it unfortunately did in the past.
Thank you, Brian. Sean Kelly.
Again, thanks to the speakers. Excuse me, to give them credit, we've heard a lot of talk about creative and imaginative solutions, but very little detail. They have tried to give us some solutions, and while we may pour holes in what they've said, at least it's a start. I'm very interested in what they said about the smart border and also the possibility or the ideal that customs connect, borders divide. However, with Brexit, excuse me, we have more or less the danger of the reintroduction of a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and therefore the need for some customs controls. Now, the examples you gave are not entirely applicable, but at the same time we can learn from them. New Zealand, Australia, two independent countries. Canada, US, two independent countries. Sweden, Norway, probably more applicable to us, but given that the United Kingdom want to leave both the single market and the customs union, I'm not sure how applicable it could be. However, I would like you to say to us what actually could work under the smart border. Would, for instance, haulage, which is a huge area for us, the movement of peoples, etc., and what wouldn't work if you had the worst situation where the United Kingdom were out of both the customs union and the single market. And thanks again, you deserve great credit for at least trying to put flesh on the bones that everybody has been speaking about up until now, but very few have actually done so. Thank you.
Thank you. Just 2 minutes. Pedro Silva Pereira, 2 minutes as well, or no more than 2 minutes. Okay.
Yes, thank you. I have time for only one question to Mr. Carlson. I will raise the issue of the free movement of persons only. Congratulations for your very interesting and smart report. But I need a clarification. You're not proposing an invisible border, as was mentioned. It will be a physical border. There will be controls. Because if I understood correctly, you're suggesting that there will be free movement of people only for those who are now covered by the common travel area. All the others will have to present themselves at the border in critical locations, and they will be required to present their passports or travel documents. So it won't be, it will be a soft border only as much as possible. And there will be border controls, at least for those who are not covered by the common travel areas. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Myra McGuinness.
Thank you, Chair. Let me just go straight to the point here. Context matters. And I have to say that in 2 of the presentations there were context, and in the third on smart borders there wasn't. There was technicalities. And that's to be expected from a technical expert. I would suggest, though, that smart borders lead to smart smugglers 2.0. And we have a long, sad tradition of very smart smugglers in that region. So perhaps you could tell me how that might be avoided. But to a more serious point, I stood on the border on Saturday, on both sides, in the cold, with real people who are absolutely terrified of the uncertainty that they will face as individuals. One of them wanted to leave the European Union and is now worried about the consequences. And the others were in my constituency who know what the consequences are. And I have to say I've just come from a hearing in the Envy Committee. Other colleagues have also left it to be here, where the health, food safety and environmental issues are also very serious around Brexit. This is where the rubber is meeting the road, the political implications of Brexit. And while I respect those who come up with technical solutions, they are not sufficient when it's a political problem. We have a part of the island of Ireland which is part of the United Kingdom, but we in the Republic of Ireland are involved in the settlement of peace. And I sit beside Diane Dodds, a colleague, a very good colleague that I work with on committee, and she is of the DUP party. And I would say to Diane Dodds in particular, Diane, I think you are a responsible politician. You have a particular responsibility now as a member of the DUP to use your incredible influence on the government of the United Kingdom to urge them to come up with a solution that takes account of the political sensitivities on all sides, because your farmers are like my farmers. They want certainty and security. They don't want disruption, fear and uncertainty. And that is what is prevailing on the ground at the moment. It's a statement, colleagues, not a question.
Thank you. I wish they will be smugglers 2.0, but they are usually ahead of the system, so they probably be 4.0 or something like that. So Charles Tannock.
Thank you, Madam President. Well, of course, just to Mr Hayes, it's not entirely clear that all the powers will automatically be re-devolved back to the devolved governments. We'll see. The government has said they will, but of course the Act doesn't say that. I also think it's disingenuous to compare the Norway-Sweden border, because as has been pointed out, Norway is in the European Economic Area, so retains 100% regulatory convergence, including the VAT regime, and mostly it's about the country of origin, third country rules of origin, which have to be checked for industrial goods and some agri and some fishing products. Just to reference the DUP, I warned about this Irish border issue in an interview I gave to Radio Irian in Christmas of 2015, but I was rubbished on Twitter by the DUP, and they claimed this was going to be a bilateral matter between London and Dublin and nothing to do with the European Union. But that's what I'm afraid was their view at that time. Of course, there is a spot of British territory which will stay in the European Union customs union post-Brexit. with a land border with an EU member state. This spot of British territory is not in the United Kingdom, that is true. These are the British sovereign bases in Cyprus, who will be obliged to stay in the UK under the UK-Cyprus Treaty within the European Union Customs Union and Single Market. So there is some precedent out there, and of course they claim it's due to an international treaty obligation. I would claim that the GFA Treaty also amounts to a moral obligation to have a borderless division on the island of Ireland. And I think given the controversy and the dangers of getting this wrong, I really do think now that the only way to solve this democratically, particularly given the fact that there is no government instalment and that the DUP now is on the hook to this issue and, of course, is sustaining the Conservative minority government in power, to hold a referendum in Northern Ireland on which the people decide which customs union and which single market do they wish to belong to, the one that pertains to the rest of the United Kingdom post-Brexit, or to stay integrated economically in a special economic area with the rest of the European Union. Why not put it to a referendum? If they believe in democracy, that to me is the only way to solve it.
I still hope there's not much trade activity in the military bases, but you never know. There's some, yeah? Okay, thank you very much. Richard Corbett.
Thank you. Two questions. The first is on the Sweden-Norway border, which is the closest we have to a smart border in comparable circumstances. My understanding is that even there are designated points of crossing for lorries with physical checkpoints for control. Can you confirm that that is the case, sometimes with delays, significant delays? My second question is, a lot of our discussion has been on the assumption that we eventually negotiate an agreement that both sides agree to and will implement in good faith, because any conceivable solution will only work if everyone is working together towards it. My question is, what happens if, in the case of scenarios where you don't have cooperation? The first such scenario is if there is no deal, on no proper divorce deal, because let's not forget that some ministers in the British government have contemplated that possibility, and one suspects that some of them actually want that possibility. The second circumstance is, let's suppose everything is all right, there is a deal, but in 5 years down the road you have a phytosanitary crisis, or you have, for instance, remember the mad cow problem in the United Kingdom, and there is not an agreement between the UK and the European Union about the nature of that. You may remember that was the case 20 years ago, and the United Kingdom government, even though it was then a member of the European Union, instituted under John Major a policy of non-cooperation in Europe on that matter and other matters. PONCE as an abbreviation, PONCE, policy of non-cooperation. What would happen in such circumstances on that border? Ireland, the Republic, would presumably have to take strong protective and measures on behalf of the rest of the European Union to stop mad cows or whatever coming across. It may need assistance from other EU countries to do that. Or is there some other solution that you can envisage?
Thank you. And the last to speak is Diane James. And then I will be asking you for comments.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. Well, my belief is that the Irish border is an issue for Dublin and London to resolve, and not the European Union, and I appreciate that's not what many of you want to hear. I welcomed the smart technology report. That was very well presented, very informative, and had some very good guidance. And I think what many people would fail to, just can't understand, and this is the essence of my question, the European Union is investing in smart border technology in the Mediterranean, in the Balkans and in other areas where there are problems with migrants, economic migrants, refugees, whatever, asylum seekers, genuine or not. So why do we have a situation where that technology and its application, which could provide a resolution to this, is being ignored in one area and yet promoted in another? And can I just finish by saying our Prime Minister, the United Kingdom Prime Minister, Mrs May, has stated categorically there will be no hard borders erected by the United Kingdom any hard border will be erected by the Irish state. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. So, whichever, I don't know where you want to, it's up to you to decide who speaks first and in what order. I just give you the freedom to choose. Yes, yes. Madam Hayward.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. I'm just going to speak as briefly as possible, and I will address the questions from Diane Dodds, Mr. Fox in particular. So firstly, just our suggestions are based on the premise that Northern Ireland will leave the European Union, that the UK Parliament will continue to be sovereign, and that there will be no discrimination or prejudice to the legitimate but divergent political aspirations of people within Northern Ireland. A key point here is that differentiation is not about the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom, and this is fundamental to upholding the agreement. That is not in question here. Differentiation already exists within the United Kingdom, and if Northern Ireland has a differentiated arrangement to enable the continuation of free movement on the island of Ireland, that does not undermine the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom. What we are trying to do here is suggest ways by which, as we've put it quite plainly, Northern Ireland can have the best of both worlds. Remarkably so, the flexibility and imagination that is being called for here is a unique opportunity to protect and uphold the agreement. And so, therefore, the choice is not either being closer to Britain or to Ireland. It's about finding arrangements, and they will require imagination and flexibility, but they will find arrangements that Northern Ireland can have the best of both worlds. And so, to get to that point about trading figures, absolutely. I mean, it's notable that the most trade within Northern Ireland is internal Northern Ireland sales, representing the underdeveloped nature of Northern Ireland's economy. Certainly, the largest portion of sales are to Great Britain. But again, we're not having to choose between having those sales and the EU market. It would be remarkable to consider that actually the choice is now to retreat back to having Britain as a market upon which Northern Ireland depends, and to put obstacles in the way of that 24-25+% percentage of sales that we would see from continuing from Northern Ireland if we find some flexible arrangement here. Professor Finnemore is going to talk more about differentiation.
I don't actually have too much to add to what Dr. Hayward has indicated, other than to stress the fact that we are not looking here to see Northern Ireland hived off to an alternative market. What we're trying to do here is propose solutions which allow Northern Ireland to maintain that deep economic integration with the rest of the United Kingdom, but at the same time facilitate as much as the status quo on the island of Ireland, and thereby support the continuation of the effectiveness of the Good Friday Agreement. And I would echo the points, and picking up on Brian Hayes' question, that there is considerable flexibility in the United Kingdom Constitution and the arrangements for devolution. And I think if we do exploit those opportunities that the Constitution holds, there are ways forward of ensuring that the disruption that Brexit will cause, undoubtedly, on the island of Ireland can be kept to a minimum.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson, and thank you all for very interesting comments and questions. Let me first underline that one of the things I said in the report and also in my presentation is that these three examples that I used in the report is not perfect example for what you could do on the Northern Ireland border. What really is the case is there are elements on each one of them that could be put together in a smarter model. That's why I use the term Smart Borders 2.0. And to the last question about Norway, Sweden example, of course there are differences between Sweden and Norway and what there ever would be or could be different options in this specific situation. However, there are also things they haven't implemented there that could be implemented here that does exist and already is in use both in Ireland, the UK and the European Union. So there are ways of mitigating the fact that some of the things of the Norway-Sweden example wouldn't be the perfect example that can be mitigated by technical solutions. So Norway-Sweden is more like a 1.5 solution than a 2.0. And what I'm saying really is that you could upgrade it to 2.0. And I think that is important to keep in mind. It's not, you can't go to the Swedish-Norwegian border and see something that could be implemented. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there are elements there that could be used. And a lot of it goes for how actually customs-to-customs cooperation is working and non-visible. Working post-pre to the elements there, working with trade facilitation as a part of the important thing of supporting small and medium-sized businesses that is very integrated across the borders. Many of these things are very similar to the situation we're talking about. So I think there are opportunities there, but it needs, of course, to be upgraded. It needs to be more integrated. It needs to be modern. Time factor, obviously, yes, time factor is very important. That's why I said we should start really today, now. Maybe yesterday, but we can't, so maybe tomorrow. But just to give you an estimation, I do think, and that's my professional view, and and of course I'm stating that now, is that with the 2-year period of transformation, it is possible to have something in place in that period of time. It wouldn't be perfect, it would be a first version, but it could be there. And the reason I'm saying it is that many of these things I'm talking about do exist in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and in the UK. And again, it's about using what is there, simplify it, upgrade it, and make technology, use technology to actually make it work better than it's working today, to make that frictionless borders. And there are a number of elements there, including that, for instance, as was up as well, the common travel area is important here, which is one of the things that you could put in place and use, but it needs to be combined with trusted travelers programs that does exist, that is voluntary. And also, again, if you are not a part of that type of program, which was one of the questions, then you might have to go to a dedicated border crossing rather than passing all the way through with only surveillance in place. So I'm not talking about building buildings or building hard borders that actually ends up with queues on both sides of the border, both for people and actually for goods. It actually can be managed in a different way with technology and with these systems in place. Now, smart smugglers 2.0. I can assure you I worked 30 years of my life of trying to fight organised crime and smugglers. And they do exist in other places in Ireland as well. They do exist actually already today while we are talking about this, and they are doing what they are doing already now. So the best way we know in our line of business of actually to handle organised crime in different shapes and different formats, like we are doing, for instance, for the moment in the Brazilian border too, they are 5 or 6 of the most dangerous countries in the world. It's about exchanging information. So the fact that there actually will be a need to exchange more information from more agencies involved here is not only a bad thing if we can make it work without delaying people moving that needs to move and goods moving that needs to be there. That's the way to actually try to get better patterns up, to use risk management intelligence better, to actually target those who are organised crime, regardless if there's a border or not. Believe me, they do exist. They do not appear just because we try to put a soft border together. At least that's my professional view of this. I do think that we can use these different elements together to make it work, and I do think the time plan still works. But again, there's not much time there, and that's also one of the reasons in my final comment here to say that I do think that we need to separate the fact that there need to be some kind of management of that border regardless what that border looks like. I think the elements are there to manage it. There are many reasons for that. There could be many, and it needs to be again then generic. It needs to be neutral to negotiation results. It needs to be able to handle a hard border and a hard Brexit situation, as well as something else that will happen. And believe me, it might change also after 2 or 3 years. It still should be there, be able to handle whatever happens. And of course, it's also about being scalable. I don't believe in having too much, and that's again my professional view, different types of models in place to actually fight organised crime and make trade work in different places in the same region. The better they can work the same way. And I think the solution we have actually, and I have proposed here, could be a scalable solution used on other borders between EU and UK as well. There are specific circumstances here. I fully acknowledge that. I did not talk about the political situation, and some of you did. I choose not to do so. I'm just saying that I think the technical solution can help you with the political situation as well. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson.
I'm sorry, but because we sort of assume that the problems and the borders and the checks are related to tariffs and customs. But we know in the European Union a lot of the checks will be coming from the single market, the food safety, for example, or the recognition issue. And so there will be more than just this sort of checking on tariffs, which is probably easier today, especially with low tariffs. And so I don't know whether you also cope with this other aspect.
Yes, of course. I think that's one of the reasons why you need to have a system like this in place, which is based really on knowing who is trading, even if it's a small and medium-sized company. And again, the trusted traders, the trusted travelers programs that we talk about, say trusted traders, for instance, take into account security, safety, and a number of issues that, again, will be interesting, maybe from different perspectives and priorities on the different sides of whatever appears that the negotiation is there. But it will be there. It will also take into the fact that this is actually in line with the Union Customs Code, which I think is very important. I think it's easier to find a solution that actually could be implemented in line with UCC and international standards than something that we would dream up that doesn't fit any of the international conventions or international standards that are there. Because both parties here as well need to negotiate trade agreements with whoever is outside our part of the world as well. And with this solution, you actually could do that. So, yes, it's taking care of not only the duties, and that's one of my points. It's not only about duties and tax. It's actually about a lot of other things. And that needs to be taken into care of that model. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Tempelang.
Just one comment. I would hate anyone to think that the idea that's been put forward that Northern Ireland should have its own free trade area with the European Union would in any sense involve hiving off the economy of Northern Ireland from the rest of the United Kingdom. That's not, I think, at all an accurate description of the consequences, and certainly not an accurate description of the situation that would result from an arrangement similar to the European Economic Area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to close this point on our agenda. Thank you very much for the studies, for the work, and we probably might meet just in a year from now. Let's hope it's all good news. But in the meantime, thank you very much, and please continue. And any ideas you might have, you are always welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you.